Well, I'm in the second of a three-part sermon series called Problems and Prayers. 2 weeks ago, we looked at that time in David's life when he had a very strong relationship with Jonathan and the complications that unfolded as Jonathan was the son of King Saul. And we celebrated that even through all of that difficulty, David never stopped believing that he was a person of destiny by God's will and by God's grace. Next week, we'll look at one of the more difficult and painful times in David's life, when David's son Absalom rises up in revolt against him, a time when David's prayer is so difficult that he does not even know what to pray for. And this morning, I'd like to look at a moment of personal crisis that David experienced. David commits adultery with Bathsheba. Now, I use that word cautiously because it means different things in different centuries. Words don't always hold a consistent meaning, and the social contexts are very, very different. One wonders how much choice Bathsheba actually had. Had she said no to the king, she probably could have been executed on the spot, and in saying yes to the king, she could very well have been killed by her own husband. So words don't always carry the same concepts as they're used. But David commits adultery with Bathsheba. Bathsheba becomes pregnant. And to cover up the whole mess, King David calls Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, back from battle. Now, David does this in the hopes that Uriah and Bathsheba will spend enough time together to make Uriah think that the child conceived is his own. And if that happens, well, the crisis has been managed. So he calls Uriah back from battle, and they have a conversation, and David encourages him to go home, and he does not go. David actually throws a very big party and gets him intoxicated, hoping that he would go home then, but he does not. Frustrated, David writes a note and gives it to Uriah and tells him to hand it to the general at the battle. And on the note it says that Uriah should be led into the most difficult part and the most dangerous part of the battlefield, and then all of the support should be withdrawn from him, and Uriah would die. And the general does as David asks. Uriah dies at the king's hand. Now, the story of David and Bathsheba will find us right where we are. And by that I mean, many of us know someone who is now, or perhaps had been, mistreated. And so the story touches that place of anger and outrage in each one of us. We know that it's wrong when someone who has power over another misuses that power in such a way. Now, I'm fairly certain that on any day of any week, you could pick up any newspaper and find the litany of that occurring. And I see no need as a part of this sermon to romp through today's papers and call attention to those tragic examples. But the story of David and Bathsheba finds us right where we are, angry and outraged that some of us are victimized. The story also finds us right where we are if we're in another place. It might raise a little anxiety for us if we've ever been tempted to cross a boundary line that we know we ought not to cross. Well, we're all human beings, and it's not wrong to feel things, but it is wrong to cross boundary lines that ought not to be crossed. Oh, the story finds us right where we are. Well, David thought he'd managed the crisis. Uriah is dead. He and Bathsheba marry. The shame was great, but it was a private shame. Or at least, that's what David thought. Until that pesky prophet Nathan just couldn't let it go. He tells a rather creative parable, and it would be a pretty good parable except he compares a woman to a lamb. Just a little dehumanizing, don't you think? And then Nathan calls David out. Calls him out for the sin that David thought was secret. Well, if you'll indulge me a scholarly footnote, the story told in 2 Samuel is written down about 500 years after the events described. In 586, the nation of Israel is conquered by the Babylonians. And while they are in captivity and distant from their land, they're sorting through their history, trying to figure out what it all means. Some of the biblical writers blame God for the devastation. Some of the biblical writers blame Israel themselves. But the writer of 2 Samuel is much more nuanced, sorting through the complexities of guilt and responsibility, of actions and of consequences. The writer of 2 Samuel is saying, do not look at the past with nostalgia. The writer is saying that everything was not perfect in the good old days. The writer of 2 Samuel is saying that at some level, we did sow some of the seeds of our own destruction. And just as the ancient king begins to take responsibility for himself, the retelling of his story is a challenge for Israel to take responsibility for themselves, even in the place of exile. Well, there have been some very interesting interpretations of the Bathsheba story. I'll briefly touch on 3 of them. The first is that it was all Bathsheba's fault. I thought someone might chuckle at that. She knows she lives next to the king, and as the king's neighbor, she certainly is aware of the ebb and flow of David's routine. She chooses carefully the time and the place. And well, you get the picture. Or maybe that's not such a good word choice in this particular context. But in that interpretation, David is powerless. He cannot resist her charms. That's right up there with blaming Eve for the forbidden fruit, or pinning the rap on Jezebel when Ahab is so irresponsible. It's a bad interpretation. It's bad because it blames the victim of a crime. It puts the responsibility on the person who had so little power. We will never learn to take responsibilities for ourselves if we scapegoat someone else. That's a bad interpretation. There's another that contends that it's all Uriah's fault. He was an inattentive husband. As a warrior, he was always off doing battle with the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites and all of the above. The interpretation goes on to say that when he was home, he was every bit the warrior that he was while traveling. That Bathsheba was the victim of domestic violence. And while what David did was wrong, it was at least a noble wrong. Kind of a rationalization. We'll never take responsibilities for ourselves if we rationalize away bad behavior. And just for comic relief, I'll throw in the third option. There's an interpretation that says it was the devil's fault. David is up on the roof of his house, and he has his bow and arrow with him. And while he's up there, the devil turns the devil's self into a bird. And as a bird, he kind of flies around and vexes David a little bit, and David gets impatient, and he picks up his bow and arrow, and he pulls it back, and he lets the arrow fly. And now because the bird is the devil, the bird redirects the course of the arrow. The arrow does not strike the bird, but it does strike the cord that was holding the curtain behind which Bathsheba was seeking privacy. Flip Wilson is not the first person to say, "The devil made me do it." Now, these 3 interpretations have 2 things in common. First, they each try to move the responsibility for bad behavior away from the person who behaved badly. And secondly, they all have in common that they cannot be found in 2 Samuel whatsoever. David does not scapegoat. David does not rationalize. And David does not create some external source of evil onto which he projects his weaknesses and his failures. To his credit, David simply accepts responsibility for his actions. His prayer is a simple one. I have sinned against the Lord. And the honest sincerity and simplicity guided David through that problem. Yeah, he made a mistake. He creates a whole host of problems for a whole host of other people. He does what he can to make amends for the harm that he caused. He rediscovers his moral center. Friends, if we have lost our moral center, know that in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, it is presented to us again. That we find in that one human life a shining example of what it means to be complete and full. And if we take the time to learn all that he teaches, if we take the time to build our lives on that example, the moral compass comes back to us. And my friends, know this, that Jesus of Nazareth is no mere character of history. That Jesus rises from the dead and lives forevermore, and that by the power of God's Spirit, Jesus of Nazareth is as close to you as your own breath, whose presence in the midst of your life can be a source of guidance, of encouragement. And by that gift, we can all find forgiveness and strength. Jesus is raised. Jesus is present. And if we allow the risen one into our lives, Jesus is the moral center that can make us whole. Amen.